I have made a match. A prince.
In the ancient kingdom of Oria, the king and his brave knights rode through the hills, their armor gleaming as they chased after a fearsome dragon. They followed the beast into a dark, foreboding cave, their hearts pounding as they ventured deeper. But before they could react, with a terrifying roar, she unleashed a blast of fire, scorching most of the knights in a single, merciless blaze. Finally, she turned to the king. The proud ruler fell to his knees, awaiting his fate. Centuries passed, and in a distant northern land, two sisters, Floria and Elodie, were gathering wood. They were the daughters of the local lord, doing all they could to help their people survive a bitter winter that left them cold and starving. Every day, more townsfolk were forced to leave, and the sisters feared there might soon be no town left at all. Just then, something unusual happened. A carriage appeared on the road. The sisters exchanged glances, wondering who would be visiting this forsaken land. They hurried back to their home, where they found their father, Lord Bayford, and their stepmother, Lady Bayford, speaking with a mysterious nun. Then, without another word, she left. Once the nun was gone, Lord Bayford turned to Elodie with a solemn look. He revealed that the royal family of Oria wished for her to marry their prince. At first, Elodie protested, shaking her head, but Lord Bayford took her aside and explained what this alliance could mean for their people. Not long after, the family boarded a ship to Oria. As they neared the kingdom, a thick mist descended upon them, so dense that even the bravest grew tense. When they finally docked, the family was awestruck by the splendor of Oria. The land was rich and prosperous, and the castle loomed above them. Servants greeted them and led them to their rooms, informing them that they would meet the royal family the next day. That night, Elodie stepped onto her balcony to take in the breathtaking view. Across the way, she noticed another balcony where a young girl her age stood, gazing out with a faraway look. But before Elodie could call out, a maid whisked the girl away. As the night deepened, Elodie struggled to sleep. She decided to pass the time by drawing. Once again, she went to the balcony, only to see that the other girl's room was now dark. Off in the distance, torches flickered on the mountain path. Someone was out there. The next day, Elodie and her family were introduced to the royal family. Queen Isabel welcomed them, and soon after, Elodie was sent to spend time with Prince Henry before the wedding. Though their initial meeting was awkward, Elodie soon found herself enjoying Henry's company. He was kind, attentive, and even complimented her on her artistic skills from the letters she'd sent. Gathering her courage, Elodie asked him about the torches she'd seen on the mountain the night before. Henry's face softened as he explained. It was a sacred ritual, an ancient ceremony to honor their ancestors. Meanwhile, Lord Bayford finished discussing the terms of the marriage with Queen Isabel. When he emerged, his face was troubled. Lady Bayford quietly approached her husband, hoping to ease his troubled mind. But when she softly asked if something was wrong, he snapped, insisting there was nothing to worry about. Determined, Lady Bayford then sought out Queen Isabel, thinking perhaps a conversation might lighten the mood. But Isabel was not in a welcoming spirit. Lady Bayford broached the subject carefully, suggesting that their families should bond and get along, but Isabel's gaze turned cold. "This is nothing more than a transaction born of necessity," she replied sharply. "I need a princess, and Bayford's land needs money." Isabel's voice held an unmistakable edge, turning on her heel and walking away without a second thought. That evening, Lady Bayford found Elodie and whispered her concerns. "Something feels off. I'm beginning to think this wedding should be canceled." But before they could discuss it further, Lord Bayford strode in as he sent them all to bed without another word. The next morning, Elodie awoke to find the maids bustling around her, preparing her for the ceremony. They dressed her in a beautiful gown, slipping a blunt dagger and a small vial of perfume into her belt. Soon enough, the ceremony began. Elodie and Henry exchanged rings, sealed their union with a kiss, and she was crowned. With a final goodbye to her family, Elodie climbed into a carriage with Henry, who explained that they would join an ancient ceremony on the mountain. The carriage brought them to a rocky staircase leading upward. As Elodie climbed, she was unsettled by the sight that greeted her at the summit, an eerie gathering of people in golden masks. Queen Isabel herself stood at the head of the crowd, dressed as a nun. She approached Elodie with a solemn expression, pressing a coin into her palm and explaining that Elodie would help protect the kingdom. Isabel shared a story that chilled Elodie's heart. When our ancestors arrived on this island, they discovered a dragon, the last of its kind. The dragon attacked them, and desperate, the king fought back. But in the end, he was forced to give up his 3 daughters, allowing them and the dragon to coexist on the island. This is the sacrifice we honor, each generation. Elodie listened in growing horror. Before Elodie could ask anything, Isabel and Henry grasped her hands, cutting both their palms and pressing them together. Now, you are truly of royal blood, Isabel announced. As part of the ritual, Elodie tossed the coin into the cave, thinking it was the final step. But as she turned to face Henry, he apologized quietly. Without warning, he threw her into the cavernous darkness below. Elodie screamed as she fell, branches and stones tearing at her dress and skin until she crashed into a pool of mud. The impact left her bruised and aching, and she drifted in and out of consciousness before she forced herself to her feet, her voice hoarse as she called for help. The cavern echoed her cry, but no one answered, except something else. A rumble sounded in the depths. Frustration welled up within her, turning to fury as she tore off her fine jewelry. She tried to climb out, but slipped and fell, her arms scraped and bleeding. Then something caught her eye. Other pieces of jewelry scattered across the floor. The chilling truth washed over her. The royal family had been sacrificing girls to this dragon for generations. A strange noise drew her attention to a nearby tunnel, where a faint light glowed. She hurried over, finding a small bird engulfed in flames. Desperately, she threw dirt over it to extinguish the fire, but it was too late. Then an ominous roar filled the air, and out of the shadows, a flock of fiery birds took flight, swirling above her before falling lifeless around her feet. But as she turned, she froze. Emerging from the darkness, the dragon loomed before her, and then spoke. Each generation, a sacrifice. I can smell it in your blood. As Elodie glanced down at the scar on her hand, a realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. The ceremony, the blood ritual, the coin, it was all a trick to deceive the dragon. But before she could even process the horror, the dragon's voice rumbled through the cavern. Without a second thought, Elodie spun around and sprinted, her heart pounding as the dragon's fiery breath lit up the tunnel behind her. As she dashed into a narrower tunnel just in time, only to realize with a shudder that she was beside a burnt body. The girl's lifeless face was eerily familiar. It was the girl she had seen on the balcony. A rumble signaled that the dragon was on her trail once more. Elodie pushed herself to move, scrambling towards a small hole in the cavern wall. But as she squeezed through, her wedding dress snagged on a jagged rock. And with one final wrench, she freed herself from the dress, stumbling forward into a smaller cavern. But even here, a stray flicker of flame reached her leg, leaving a burn that tore a scream from her lips. The dragon let out an irritated growl as it pressed against the tunnel entrance. As the beast retreated, she felt the dull weight of the blunt dagger at her waist. Then she tore a strip from her ruined dress, gritting her teeth as she bound the burn on her leg. The pain was excruciating, but she forced herself to continue. Next, Elodie uncorked the small diffuser to catch a spark. A tiny flame sprang to life, casting a warm glow around her, a makeshift lantern. With a faint glimmer lighting her way, she ventured deeper into the cave. Before long, she found a narrow passage and began crawling through, but again, her dress got caught. Exasperated, she tugged herself free, sliding down the passage with a gasp. As she reached the bottom, but a faint light glimmered in the distance. Refusing to give in, she rose, leaning against the cold walls as she limped forward. She reached the end of the tunnel, only to nearly stumble over the edge of a cliff. Across the gap, the mysterious light beckoned from the other side. With a fierce determination, she removed her wedding ring and hurled it into the abyss. Taking a few steps back, she sprinted forward and leapt across the chasm, her heart racing as her fingers slipped on the slick stone. Her belt snagged on a rock, but it quickly tore loose, until, with a desperate grab, she drove the dagger into a crack and hung on. Pulling herself up with all her remaining strength, she finally reached solid ground. The light was coming from dozens of softly glowing slugs clinging to the walls. Relieved, she tore off a sleeve, gently gathering the slugs inside to fashion a crude lantern. Elodie moved deeper into the cavern and soon found a small pool of water. But when she brought it to her lips, the taste was so foul she spat it out. Instead, she looked up and noticed a patch of ice hang from the ceiling, with a few fresh drops trickling down. Standing beneath it, she caught each precious drop, savoring the cool relief. But her moment of peace shattered as the ice began to melt faster, the dripping turning red with reflected firelight. Elodie's eyes widened in horror as she saw the dragon's blazing form breaking through the ice. Elodie fled down a nearby tunnel. She darted into a narrow passage, small enough to block the dragon's pursuit. Inside, the walls held carvings and messages scratched by trembling hands, each a reminder of the girls who had come before her. Among them, she found a V carved deeply into the stone. "Victoria," she murmured, tracing the letter with a finger. A heavy grief settled over her as she thought of those who had shared her fate. After tending to her leg, which was now swollen and throbbing with pain, she curled up beside her glowing lantern of slugs, exhaustion finally overtaking her. In her dreams, she saw the spirits of the other sacrifices, lost souls, their faces etched with pain, betrayal, and terror. One figure caught her attention, a girl, scratching her name onto the wall. Victoria looked back, her eyes hollow and haunting. "It's all a lie," she murmured. Elodie jolted awake, her heart pounding. She looked down to find her leg covered in slugs. Horrified, she brushed them off, but as she examined her skin, she was stunned. The wound was almost entirely healed. A spark of hope lit within her. Gently, Elodie placed a slug on the larger wound on her leg. "Thank you," she whispered. Feeling a surge of renewed strength, her gaze caught on a faint drawing scratched into the stone. Someone had made it this far and left instructions. That meant one of them had survived. According to the map, 3 forks lay ahead in the twisting tunnels, and she had to choose the middle path each time. The map also hinted she should listen for music and follow the crystals that would lead her to freedom. Taking a deep breath, Elodie tore off the tattered parts of her dress, carved her name onto the wall beside the others, and set off toward the middle fork, ignoring the distant rumble of the dragon's growls echoing through the tunnels. Soon enough, a faint, haunting melody reached her ears, pulling her forward until the narrow passage opened up to a wall of crystals. Humming softly as beams of sunlight hit them through a tiny gap high above, a crack to the outside world. Nearby, something caught her eye. A crown with a single letter V etched onto it. She tore more strips from her dress, wrapping them around her hands and feet for protection, then grabbed the crown and began her ascent. Just as she reached a high point, one of the crystals snapped under her grip and she plummeted down, clutching Victoria's crown. Elodie looked back in horror. The beast's molten eyes glared up at her. With a final push, she climbed through and staggered onto a narrow ledge on the side of the mountain. The sight that met her eyes drained the last bit of hope she'd clung to. Then, a distant sound pierced her sorrow, looking down to see a group of riders approaching the mountain. She barely managed to stand, shouting at the top of her lungs for help. But at that moment, the dragon had arrived, its wings beating the air as it settled in front of the exit. She stumbled back, and her eyes fell on yet another message etched into the wall near the opening. Not safe. Her gaze dropped to the ground, where a skeleton lay among the rocks. Victoria, she hadn't made it out after all. The dragon began to draw in a deep breath, preparing to unleash her fire, but stopped at the sound of a distant voice calling out, "Elodie!" The dragon growled, and with a furious shriek, launched herself into the air to investigate. It's revealed that Lord Bayford has come, with 2 knights and a guide, to look for Elodie. Seizing the moment, Elodie crept back into the cavern as she followed the echoes of the voices bouncing through the tunnels. But instead, it led to a larger chamber where she stopped cold. A nest filled with 3 small, shriveled bodies of baby dragons, long dead. Victoria's words echoed in her mind, "It's all a lie." A chill ran down her spine as the truth unfolded. The dragon hadn't been the first to attack. The king had. She'd been avenging her murdered children. The king had tried to wipe out her family, leaving her the last of her kind. And for that, the royals had paid, offering 3 women's blood as atonement, each generation feeding her grief and rage. Steeling herself, Elodie pressed on until she finally heard her father's familiar voice nearby. A knight drew his sword, but the dragon snatched him up with ease, lifting him into the air and dropping him from a terrifying height. The remaining knight panicked, but the dragon's claws crushed him with one swift stomp. Lord Bayford drew his own weapon, stepping forward to face the beast. The dragon let out a low, rumbling laugh, wrapping her tail around Bayford, pulling him close as she swiped the sword from his grasp. She dropped him with a mocking snarl, "Call her, if you dare." Hidden in the shadows, Elodie watched. Her father's face was pale, his courage fading. But his defiance only fueled the dragon's rage. With a furious snarl, she thrust her massive claw into his chest, piercing his heart. Bayford crumpled, his last breath leaving him as Elodie stifled a cry, a sound too soft for the dragon to detect. Then a faint sound came from deeper in the cavern. The dragon's ears twitched and she whirled around to pursue the noise. Heartbroken, Elodie whispered a final goodbye to her father, then seized the rope he'd left behind, using it to climb up and out of the dragon's lair. She moved quickly, each pull hoisting her closer to freedom. Outside, she found her father's horse waiting and leapt onto its back, urging it forward. But soon she slid from the saddle, letting the horse bolt away, a distraction for the dragon. The beast followed the horse with furious speed as the poor creature vanished in a flash of fire. The storm clouds above gathered in a dark, swirling mass, a signal to the kingdom that their ancient pact had been shattered. In the castle, Isabel looked out at the storm with narrowed eyes. Understanding what it meant, she ordered her guards to bring her youngest daughter, Floria, to the ceremonial bridge. Lady Bayford attempted to stop them, but the guards shoved Lady Bayford aside. Meanwhile, Elodie stumbled down the mountainside and found Lady Bayford, her side bleeding, but her eyes fierce with determination. Elodie felt a wave of fury and heartbreak. "I'll bring her back," she promised, helping Lady Bayford onto her father's horse before riding off toward the mountain herself. Back on the bridge, Isabel stood beside Floria, who trembled as her mother's dagger sliced her palm. She watched as her blood mixed with Isabel's and splattered onto the stone, marking her as the dragon's next prey. With a shove, Floria fell, disappearing into the cavern's mouth just as Elodie arrived, too late to stop them. The beast hadn't hurt her. Elodie descended the mountain with the rope, recalling every twist and turn as she retraced her path through the tunnels, moving faster this time. When she reached the dragon's lair, she set a careful trap, positioning an old suit of armor and tying it with rope near a tiny flame. Once everything was ready, she retreated and waited. As the flame burned through the rope, the armor fell with a loud clang, luring the dragon from her lair. With the beast gone, Elodie crept inside, finding Floria pale and groggy but alive, her injured leg slowing her down. Together, they hobbled out, stopping only when they heard the dragon's furious roar echoing through the cavern. She called out to the dragon, trying to reason with her, but the creature's heart was too full of wrath to listen. She lunged, breathing fire, and Elodie barely dodged in time, redirecting her strike into the dragon's open mouth, but sending her tumbling down a steep edge, where she clung to the rocks, her arms scorched. The dragon ripped the sword free, but Elodie seized the opportunity to swim out of harm's way. As she resurfaced, the dragon pounced, driving her claw deep into Elodie's side. But with her last ounce of strength, Elodie pulled out her dagger and drove it into the dragon's eye. The beast let out a howl, tossing Elodie across the lair. She advanced as the dragon, half blind but undeterred, bore down on her. Elodie struck again, the blade biting into the creature's chest but barely slowing her down. Enraged, the dragon lashed out, but Elodie managed to pierce her paw, forcing her to drop her once again. As the dragon gathered herself for another strike, Elodie noticed something. The dust from the cave floor shifted slightly over a curved structure, forming a natural mirror. An idea sparked in her mind. She positioned herself before it and taunted the dragon. As the creature reared back and exhaled a torrent of fire, Elodie dove aside. The flames bounced off the mirror and crashed back into the dragon, engulfing her in a blaze. Afterward, Elodie shows the dragon the scar on her hand to prove that the beast has been killing innocent girls, not royals. The dragon asks her to end it, but Elodie drops the sword and refuses to continue this circle of hatred, gathering slugs and placing them on the dragon's wounds to heal. Back at the castle, Isabel was preparing another wedding, a cruel trick to lure a new girl into her web. But suddenly, a single coin rolled down the altar, stopping at her feet. Everyone turned as Elodie stepped inside, her face set with quiet defiance. "Leave now," she warned the bride, who gathered her family and fled. Only a few servants followed her advice. A dark shadow filled the room as the dragon returned, fire blazing from her mouth. She exhaled her rage over the hall, consuming Isabel and every member of the royal line. The walls trembled as flames engulfed the castle. Henry closed his eyes, whispering a quiet acceptance before the blaze overtook him. Outside, Elodie walked away from the burning castle, her head held high. Days later, Elodie, Floria, and a recovered Lady Bayford boarded a ship loaded with supplies and treasure, setting sail for home. In the skies above, the dragon circled, their gazes meeting in a silent nod of mutual respect. For the first time in years, peace had returned, and this time it was a peace built on truth, not fear.